In this episode, we'll continue our delicious discussion about cacao. Join us as we delve into the fascinating history of chocolate and capitalism, tracing cacao's journey from the rainforests of the Northwest Amazon to its conquest of the industrialized world. We'll also uncover the intriguing tale of how a clever candy maker used the fame of Babe Ruth to sell his new chocolate bar, leading to a courtroom battle over the iconic name.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Plants of the Gods. I'm your host, Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. In this episode, I want to talk about chocolate and capitalism and how this once obscure plant, native to the rainforests of the Northwest Amazon, much beloved by indigenous peoples of Central America, like the Olmecs, the Aztecs, and the Mayas, went on to conquer much of the industrialized world. So we're going to talk about cacao and capitalism. And if you think that capitalism sometimes gets things wrong, is often unfair, and sometimes produces hilarious results, have I got a story for you. In the early 1900s, the U.S. candy business was booming. Demand for chocolate was soaring, and a particularly clever candy maker, a German-American businessman by the name of Otto Schneering, invented a new candy bar. Business people had figured out that you could make money by selling chocolate bars, but you could make even more money if you created new bars which combined chocolate with other confections. For example, if you combine chocolate with caramel, you get a Milky Way. If you mix chocolate with nougat, you have the Snickers bar. Hazelnut mixed with chocolate birthed Nutella, and the combination of chocolate with peanut butter gave rise to Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Blending chocolate, peanut butter, and caramel produced the iconic Butterfinger. Meanwhile, the market for these new chocolate candies was enormous and continuing to grow. Now, Schneering had invented a combination candy bar, which consisted of chocolate, peanuts, and caramel. He had first called it candy cake, even though it contained no cake. Yet it proved popular with consumers. He nonetheless decided that a better name would translate into better sales. At the time, the most famous athlete in America, if not the world, was Babe Ruth. At a time when baseball was truly the national pastime, Ruth was shattering home run records while leading his New York Yankees to multiple championships. He was a cultural icon, synonymous with success, excellence, and the American dream. Ruth's popularity transcended baseball, inspiring fashion trends, films, and songs. His charisma, his larger-than-life persona, and his off-the-field antics provided constant fodder for the media, and he was often featured in advertisements, endorsements, and newsreels. And in 1921, Schneering decided to capitalize on Babe Ruth's fame by changing the name of his confection from candy cake to Babe Ruth. When asked how he chose the new name, Schneering disingenuously replied that he had named it in honor of the late daughter of President Grover Cleveland, a child who had died 17 years earlier. To quote from my very favorite book on chocolate, The Book of Chocolate by H.P. Newquist, "This was a lovely story, but many of Schneering's associates disputed it. They claimed that the Baby Ruth bar, as many people suspected, was named after baseball icon Babe Ruth. According to them, the star baseball player was as famous as any athlete in America, and Schneering had approached Babe Ruth about using his name for the repackaged candy cake bar. Ruth demanded an exorbitant amount of money from Schneering, and Schneering refused. Instead, he changed Babe Ruth to Baby Ruth and concocted the neat story about celebrating little Ruth Cleveland, who'd passed away 17 years earlier. Schneering stuck to his story so strongly that when, years later, Babe Ruth himself tried to start his own candy line using his own name, Schneering sued to stop him, saying the name was too close to Baby Ruth. In an ironic twist, Schneering won the case. So let's talk about cacao in the Spanish Empire. We'll pick up the story where we left off at the end of the previous episode in Mexico, round near the year 1521. When the conquistadores destroyed the Aztec Empire in Mexico, the local cultivation of cacao nonetheless continued unabated, albeit under the auspices of Spanish colonial rule. The Spanish colonizers and conquistadores and the Spaniards that followed them appropriated and enslaved indigenous labor and land to establish vast cacao plantations known as haciendas in the tropical regions of southern Mexico like Tabasco, Veracruz, and Chiapas. Chiapas being where the Aztec rulers themselves had sourced their favorite chocolate prior to the conquest. Indigenous farmers, who were once proud Aztec warriors and exalted princesses, were forced into slave labor and toiled under brutish Spanish overlords to meet the seemingly insatiable demand for cacao in Europe. Meanwhile, in colonial Mexico, the mix of indigenous cultures and European influences gave rise to a diverse array of chocolate-based delicacies, ranging from mole poblano, a savory sauce infused with chocolate and chili peppers, to champorado, a thick, spiced, nourishing chocolate drink enjoyed during festive occasions. If you've never had mole, and you've never had champorado, and you consider yourself a chocolate lover, turn off this podcast immediately and go to the best Mexican restaurant you can find and order both of these delicacies. Meanwhile, the demand for cacao in Spain, where cacao beans had been brought by conquistadors returning from the New World, led to the establishment of cacao plantations in various Spanish colonies outside of Mexico, particularly in regions with favorable climates, such as Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and parts of the Caribbean. It is highly ironic that they established cacao plantations in Amazonia because that is precisely where the plant originated. As covered in the previous episode, cacao had been transported from northwest Amazonia to Central America, where it was being cultivated and consumed by people like the Aztecs and the Mayas long before the arrival of the first Europeans in 1492. There were indeed desultory efforts to bring cacao and chocolate to Spain by the original conquistadors in the 1520s, but it took a few decades before the continental Spaniards developed a taste for the novel beverage. The first recorded commercial shipment from Mexico, which was from the port of Veracruz, to the Andalusian ports in southern Spain was in 1585. This marked the beginning of the global trade in cacao. In pre-Columbian Mexico, the Aztec chocolate drink could include a variety of admixtures, from vanilla, which is an orchid native to tropical America, to chili peppers, to honey. Without honey, however, chocolate is a bitter beverage and an acquired taste. In Spain, though, chocolate partnered in a heavenly marriage, and that partner was sugar. Interestingly, sugar was not native to Spain any more than was chocolate. Sugar made its way into Spain through trade routes with the Arab world in the 8th century, specifically from regions like North Africa and the Middle East. The Moors, who were of Arab and Berber descent, played a significant role in introducing sugar into Spain. As we heard in the rum episode a few seasons back, we talked about the Arab influence on Spain, the Moors bringing not only sugar but also advanced agricultural techniques, including the cultivation of sugar cane, which contributed to the spread of sugar production across the Iberian Peninsula. The irresistible combination of sugar and chocolate became all the rage amongst the members of the Spanish monarchy and upper classes. The drink became so popular amongst the upper crust and the clergy that they invented a new term for the social custom of gathering together to consume it, chocolotadas, or as one wag translated it, somewhere between a chocolate party and a chocolate orgy. End of quote. However, chocolate did face some initial opposition in Spain from a powerful institution, the Catholic Church, due to its association with Aztec heathen rituals, which led some early Spanish missionaries and clergy in both Mexico and Spain to view it with suspicion and disdain. The church at that time, obsessed with fasting during penitential periods like Lent, regarded chocolate as a rich and indulgent treat, which it most assuredly is, and it was the subject of heated debate as to whether chocolate could be consumed during a period where people were fasting. In the end, the chocoholics won out. In her 2002 classic book, Chocolate, The Nature of Indulgence, Ruth Lopez writes, quote, "It didn't take long for chocolate to become all the rage among the elite of Mexico, then Spain, and eventually the rest of Europe. One famous incident in Chiapas, in southern Mexico, is often told as an example of how powerful chocolate fever can be. Apparently, a number of Creole women found they could not make it through Mass without taking their chocolate, which their servants would serve them in church. This behavior enraged the bishop, but the ladies ignored his request to stop, arguing that the long service made them weak and that the chocolate sustained them. When he threatened to excommunicate anyone taking chocolate in church, they responded by boycotting the church, whereupon he threatened to boycott anyone who boycotted the church. Shortly thereafter, the bishop became ill and died. The rumor was that someone had poisoned his chocolate." End of quote. Chocolate eventually underwent a significant transformation in Spain, evolving from a ceremonial beverage primarily enjoyed by the aristocracy to a widely consumed delicacy accessible to people from all backgrounds. Recognizing the commercial potential of cacao, Spanish entrepreneurs pioneered the establishment of the first chocolate houses in cities like Barcelona and Seville, centers of commerce and trade. These venues allowed patrons to indulge in the fashionable beverage while partaking in the intellectual discussions and social interactions. This is strikingly reminiscent of the history of coffee that we covered in previous episodes, a new and popular stimulant that catalyzes discussion and fraternization between classes. No wonder the church was nervous in both cases. Furthermore, it's important to note that during this period, chocolate was the primary stimulant in Spain, as coffee had not made its way to Iberia in the way it had to both England and France. In her book, Lopez writes, quote, "The Spanish court and clergy were the first in Europe to use chocolate, but in this period of political marriages and mergers among European royalty and of travel within the monastic world, chocolate soon made its way from Spain to the rest of Europe." End of quote. The trend of chocolate houses spread beyond Spain to cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam during the 17th and 18th century. These establishments became fashionable social hubs where Europeans from various colonial powers, including Portugal, France, and the Netherlands, also developed a fondness for chocolate. This growing demand for cacao led to its cultivation in tropical regions outside the Americas, starting in African colonies like the islands in the Gulf of Guinea, such as São Tomé and Príncipe, then spreading to other colonies in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, where favorable tropical climates allowed for its cultivation alongside other tropical cash crops like coffee, sugar, and spices. The Dutch brought cacao to Indonesia, the French brought it to Madagascar, the British brought it to India, and the Spanish got into the act as well, planting it in the Philippines, which at the time was a Spanish colony. The global trade in cacao and chocolate further flourished due to expanding maritime networks during the age of exploration and colonialism. Ships transported cacao beans, chocolate products, and various commodities between colonies and European markets, shaping interconnected global trade routes. However, this expansion relied heavily on forced labor practices, including the use of enslaved Africans on cacao plantations in tropical regions. This dark aspect of colonial history highlights the exploitation and suffering endured by enslaved individuals in pursuit of profit and culinary pleasures for Europeans. Shamefully, some of these slavery practices persist even today, and we'll discuss this in an upcoming episode. However, it would be incorrect to suggest that the Spaniards freely shared this botanical wealth with other colonial powers at the outset, for cacao beans were the black gold of the day. During the Age of Empire, European powers fiercely competed over New World resources and treasures, both mineral and botanical, anxious to establish and expand financial monopolies. For most of the 1500s, the Spaniards maintained a strict cacao monopoly, keeping the rest of the world in the dark. According to Nyquist, on more than one occasion in the 1500s, Spanish vessels laden with cacao beans were seized by the Dutch and English pirates who, unaware of the beans' purpose and potential and value, mistook them for sheep droppings, so they sunk the ships. Unbeknownst to them, these pirates were consigning vast fortunes, exceeding the worth of all the stolen indigenous gold and silver, to the ocean floor. So let me detail an example of the type of adventure and skullduggery entailed as the colonial powers attempted to filch each other's plants of the gods, even though those plants were not theirs in the first place. I want to focus on the country of Suriname, formerly Dutch Guiana, or in the northeast shoulder of South America, where I've done much of my personal research. In particular, I want to give a case history of how the Dutch stole the plants from the Spaniards. Besides, who can resist an ethnobotanical history which involved smuggling, pirates, and murder? Cornelius van Sommersdijk was born in 1637 into a prominent Dutch family. In 1683, he was appointed the Governor-General of Dutch Guiana, that is Suriname, on the northeast coast of South America. During his governorship, he faced many challenges, including conflicts with the indigenous peoples, slave revolts, disputes with British settlers, and economic difficulties within the colony. One of the notable events during his tenure was an expedition he sent west to recover the remains of the booty of the Dutch treasure ship, the Gilded Dragon, in the Orinoco River of what is now Venezuela. In 1688, the ship had been attacked, looted, and sunk by presumably British pirates operating out of the pirate capital of Jamaica, Port Royal. You see, treasure ships laden with gold and silver, filched from the Aztecs in Mexico or the Incas in Peru, had to sail through the Caribbean on their way to Spain, and British pirates used Caribbean island harbors as lairs from which they plundered the treasures that had been plundered from the Native Americans by the Spaniards in the first place. Sommersdijk organized a salvage expedition led by his son to retrieve whatever may have been left of the cargo, which was known to have included a significant amount of gold and silver, as well as, we believe, cacao plants. Digging deeply into the historical accounts, I was unable to learn if the Dutch found any precious metals, but they did return to Suriname with something more valuable, cacao plants. Some accounts claim that the plants were taken from the wrecked ship. Others claim that the plants came from the rainforest along the Orinoco River, since the cacao tree is indigenous to that region. In either case, removing these plants from Spanish colonies like Venezuela was deemed a capital offense by colonial authorities, punishable by death. Once again, the irony is that cacao has been proven to be much more valuable than all the gold and silver taken from the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and it is an endlessly renewable resource, unlike gold and silver. In an unhappy footnote, several years later, Governor Sommersdijk was murdered by a group of disgruntled Dutch settlers. Some historians attributed his murder to a pay dispute with his soldiers, while others believe it was caused by economic difficulties in the colony. Still others state that it was due to the failure of the expedition to return with gold and silver. After all, they only returned with cacao, the original black gold. Now, in response to messages we have received here at Plants of the Gods, in particular comments and responses we received as a result of our coffee episodes, which are some of the most popular of the entire podcast, I want to walk through the basic steps for making chocolate. The first step is, of course, harvesting. Typically between 20 and 50 beans are produced by each football-shaped cacao pod, which are carefully harvested, usually by hand. The cocoa beans are surrounded by a sweet, white, and juicy pulp, which is sometimes removed and allowed to ferment to produce a sort of wine. Fermentation. The cocoa seeds, often called beans even though they are not legumes and therefore not true beans, are removed from the pods and placed in shallow containers where they are allowed to ferment for 2 to 7 days. During this step, bacteria and yeasts break down the pulp, during which the beans begin to develop a chocolatey flavor. That is, the beans themselves, in their raw form, do not smell or taste of chocolate. The next step is drying. The seeds are typically placed on mats in the sun to dry for about a week. This reduces moisture content, which is crucial for reducing spoilage during the eventual storage and shipping process. Shipping and processing being the next stage, the dried cacao beans in the tropics are then packaged and shipped to chocolate manufacturing facilities, most of which are in the industrialized world, far from the tropical regions in which these cacao beans are grown. Next, the beans are roasted. They're thoroughly cleaned and then roasted at controlled temperatures to enhance their taste. Following that is the stage known as breaking, cracking, and winnowing. The beans are cracked open by running them through a mill, which breaks them into small pieces and helps separate the nibs from the papery husk. The nibs are the heart of the cacao bean. They're rich in nutrients and contain both the cocoa solids and the cocoa butter. They have a rich and deep chocolate flavor and are sometimes included in chocolate bars and other desserts to impart a special chocolateness. The nibs are then ground up to create a paste known as cocoa mass or chocolate liquor, although it contains no alcohol. It's the heat generated by the grinding process that liquefies the cocoa butter present in the nibs and creates a paste instead of just a dried powder resulting from crushing the beans. The next step is called conching or conking. After grinding, the chocolate is mixed and aerated for an extended period, which helps the chocolate develop flavor, texture, and smoothness while reducing acidity and enhancing aroma. The next step is tempering, which entails carefully heating and then cooling the chocolate, which stabilizes the cocoa butter crystals, which gives the chocolate its smooth texture and glossy appearance. Tempering also helps determine the snap of that particular bar when broken, an important characteristic for chocoholics. Molding and wrapping. After tempering, the chocolate is poured into molds to determine its final shape. Remember how most chocolate, particularly high-end bars or candies, not only have a characteristic shape, but also a unique signature or initial stamped upon them. The chocolate is then wrapped and shipped, and the best part, eaten. So to sum up, I'm going to do something I've avoided in the previous 50 episodes of Plants of the Gods. I'm going to quote Wikipedia because it summarizes the aforementioned process succinctly and accurately. Quote, "The seeds of the cacao tree have an intense, bitter taste and must be fermented to develop the flavor. After fermentation, the seeds are dried, cleaned, and roasted. The shell is removed to produce cocoa nibs, which are then ground to cocoa mass, unadulterated chocolate in rough form. Once the cocoa mass is liquefied by heating, it is called chocolate liquor. The liquor may also be cooled and processed into its two major components, cocoa solids and cocoa butter. Baking chocolate, also called bitter chocolate, contains cocoa solids and cocoa butter in varying proportions without any added sugar. Powdered baking cocoa, which contains more fiber than cocoa butter, can be processed with alkali to produce Dutch cocoa. Much of the chocolate consumed today is in the form of sweet chocolate, a combination of cocoa solids, cocoa butter, or added vegetable oils and sugar. Milk chocolate is sweet chocolate that additionally contains milk powder or condensed milk. White chocolate contains cocoa, butter, sugar, and milk, but no cocoa solids. End of quote. That's all, folks.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge of biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In the next episode, hear Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with Denise Castronovo, founder of Florida's Castronovo Chocolate, as we learn about the ethnobotany of heirloom chocolate.